When I first told people that I was going to study journalism at university, I was met time and time again with a response along the lines of, but anybody with a phone and a Facebook account is a journalist these days. And in a lot of rudimentary ways, they weren't wrong. We are all well aware that sharing information has never been more accessible or instantaneous than it is today. Good journalism is made up of a number of values and principles that allow it to remain unbiased and informative. These include impartiality, accuracy, transparency, and disclosure of all essential facts. So what happens when these traditional journalism practices are left to compete on a level playing field with the circulation of public discourse and misinformation? Well, you end up in a situation like the one we are in right now, where the journalism industry is fighting to remain relevant and public trust in the news and media is diminishing. I didn't have the slightest clue what I wanted to do with my life for most of high school. And it was really only as that lingering question of what next became much harder to brush off that I decided on a journalism degree. At the time, it simply seemed like a way to utilise my writing and communication skills that would see me exploring, interacting and innovating in the world around me. This choice to become a journalist, while initially decided by a simple process of elimination, came to mean much more to me than I ever anticipated, as it entangled itself in experiences that reshaped my entire life. This is my little brother Joel, and in my final year of high school, he was killed in a single vehicle car accident. In an instant, myself and my family were thrown into the news and media spotlight at the very worst time of our entire lives. Throughout that time, we were exposed to the news and media industry at its absolute worst. Their approach towards us, as well as their methods of obtaining and publishing material, were insensitive, uncommunicative, sensationalized, and at times even factually inaccurate. There are no words to describe how it feels to live through the death of a younger sibling when you are only young yourself. Trying to navigate that while also dealing with the story being treated like a piece of meat was particularly abhorrent. But I'm not here today looking for sympathy. I'm here because I want your attention. This experience made me all too aware that the news and media has lost touch with the fact that there are real people behind every news story that we read, write, or talk about. The horrible experiences that I had with the media were deeply rooted in journalistic practices intending to provoke public interest or excitement, often at the expense of honesty, accuracy, or any consideration for the people within the story. This concept is called sensationalism, and it capitalises on society's hunger for information and inherent fascination with other people's trauma. It exploits unusual stories by expanding or overemphasising on the facts to seem more exciting or dramatic, with the intention of drawing in more readers or viewers. When a tragedy, like a fatal car accident, happens, to some extent, big, bold, front-page headlines are unavoidable. And while uncomfortable, even living it, you have some sense of understanding around why the public does need to be informed of the hard facts. The who, what, when, and where undoubtedly fall within the public interest and constitute news value. The issue arises when journalists and media organisations step over that line. For the most part, myself and my family kept our interactions with the media to a minimum throughout that time, and we didn't engage with requests for our side of the story. But over a year later, I wrote a victim impact statement and I read it out loud to the court. Before we knew that Joel had died, I had actually been sent out looking for him that afternoon. And with the family settings on Find My iPhone, I was live tracking his location. Pulled directly and only from my statement to the court, the local media published that I was parked on the side of the road only a few hundred metres from the crash site when I received the news of Joel's death over the phone. The media handpicked only the most gut-wrenching parts from not only mine, but from the statements of everybody that spoke that day. And they put together a half-page article divulging our suffering. In terms of news value, the only part that could truly be justified were a few paragraphs in the back end explaining the proceedings and outcome in court that day. I wonder to this day what right the media had to my experiences. Only 2 months after the accident that Joel was killed in, the photos from that car crash were reused by the local media as the cover photo for a completely unrelated story. This meant that that photo was back in my social media feeds and circulating online. Upon my family's request, it was eventually removed from that article, but it shouldn't have been used in the first place. A local media publication in a small regional city should have had the humanity to know that that image was far from generic. The news and media cannot pander to an individual or a family, as that would compromise reliability and leave much of many stories untold. And yes, photos in any company's database are theirs to use. But only somebody completely detached from their community could neglect the devastation connected to those photos, especially that soon after the car accident had taken place. The car crash that Joel died in was a double fatality. Joel, the other girl who lost her life, and the driver were all teenagers. And there is absolutely no doubt that between them, entire communities were impacted by that crash. Friends, teachers from school, co-workers, family, friends, even the first responders. Recirculating that image online when there was absolutely no reason to do so was a thoughtless and senseless choice, and it did nothing but perpetuate harm. It's the epitome of how detached and indifferent the journalism industry has become from the stories that they report on. My lived experiences do give me unique insight into this problem. As a journalism student who's been on the receiving end of harmful reporting, I feel compelled to use my perspective to start this conversation around the damage that sensationalism and desensitised media is doing within society. Sensationalism and other poor journalism practices have become much more prevalent as our media consumption becomes increasingly digital. The intention is to keep people engaged in news and current affairs, but it's these same practices that are compromising the perceived credibility and reliability of modern-day journalism. The digital media age has begun to see media organisations more focused on getting the most clicks on their articles, or drawing in readers using whatever means necessary. This sees journalists publishing deliberately misleading headlines, or prioritising being the first to break a story above all else. Journalism is a powerful profession. The role of seeking out information, dictating what actually then becomes news, and presenting that to society, that holds a lot of significance. But even a career as invasive and investigative journalism can be approached with kindness and a level of consideration. The pursuit of that power doesn't have to come at the expense of the people that we report on and for. I mentioned earlier that society has this inherent fascination with other people's trauma. And it's through this that we see behaviour like slowing down as you drive past an accident site, just to try and see what happened. Deliberately going through a street where a house burnt down to see the damage and devastation firsthand, maybe even taking a photo. These are normal human tendencies. I can recognise them in myself, and I became especially conscious of them after Joel died and my entire belief system was upended and rewritten. I'm not here today to shame this part of human nature, but rather to propose that actively marketing media towards these tendencies is ethically questionable, and it's establishing a system that perpetuates, escalates, and ultimately encourages the desensitisation of society. Under this model, the industry is capitalising on the very worst parts of human nature and the misfortune of others. There's room for discussion about how we approach this next wave of journalism. Journalists from cadetship programs or higher education are trained with an incredible toolkit and insight into what makes and stands the test of time as ethical, newsworthy reporting. But this is getting lost in an industry that is so overwhelmed by competition that it's begun encouraging those within it to beat that person with a phone and a Facebook account at their own game. Everyday people and active spreaders of misinformation are posting, sharing and tweeting in pursuit of relevancy and attention. And in order to compete, the news media has fallen into replicating their approaches, doing exactly the same thing but more of it, flooding our media consumption with more of their content, more headlines, more sensationalized news, but more doesn't cut it. And it's doing an injustice to the capabilities of journalists. The news and media industry needs to be reframed so that rather than encouraging more, they strive instead to do and be better. Not more, but better. So, what role do consumers of news media play in that shift? The answer lies in being conscious and critical of the type of news that you're consuming. By identifying the type of news that you're engaging with, you can distance yourself from sensationalized, desensitized, and invasive stories. By disengaging with news that perpetuates the problem, you are helping stop this cycle by showing news media organisations that these approaches are not on. Next time you're scrolling through your feed, reading an article, or even sitting down for the 6 o'clock news, stop and think about what it is that you're actually consuming. Is it genuine news? Or is it sensationalism? Remind yourself that there are very real people on the other end, and question how much of your media consumption actually falls into a need-to-know basis. How would you feel if that was your story? The people that we read, write, and talk about are real people with real experiences, real emotions, and real lives. They are not entertainment, and it's time we start treating them as such. Thank you.